The designers of the World War II era created all sorts of airplanes. Just look, the asymmetrical Blohm and Voss BV 141, the world's first jet-powered wing, the Horton Ho 9, the American Vought V-173, an experimental vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, the flying tank A-40 by designer Oleg Konstantinovich Antonov, the Junkers Ju-287, a German bomber that was the first in the world to use a swept wing, and the Zveno project, in which the heavy bomber TB-1 carried two I-5 fighters on its wings. But despite such diversity, other aircraft played the main role in historical events. It is considered that one of the main aircraft of the Second World War for our country was the Soviet Il-2. It went through the entire war, with more than 36,000 attack aircraft being produced. This made it the most mass-produced combat aircraft of all time. The IL-2 became as important to the Red Army as air and bread, as Stalin put it. In the Red Army, the aircraft received the nickname Hunchback for its characteristic fuselage shape. The designers themselves called the aircraft they developed a flying tank. German pilots called it a concrete plane, butcher, meat grinder, and finally, Black Death for its resilience. It is accepted that from the very beginning of its combat use on the front, the Il-2 attack aircraft proved itself to be a very durable and resilient combat aircraft, and it saved the lives of many pilots, maintaining flight with such damages that would have been, so to speak, incompatible with life for any other aircraft. There were cases when damaged in battle aircraft, having made a normal landing at their airfield, literally fell apart or were not subject to repair due to a significant number of large and small damages. The Assault Aviation Regiment engineers mentioned in the report, it was hard to imagine how such aircraft could continue to fly. One thing was clear, the pilots took all measures to reach the aerodrome, knowing about the serious damage to the aircraft. Of course, the high survivability of the Il-2 was fully utilized mainly by experienced pilots. There are very few recorded instances of young pilots returning on damaged aircraft, and yet, thanks to the exceptional survivability of the Il-2, attack pilots often manage to either make a forced landing on any small suitable area or fly back to their aerodrome. About 10% of damaged Il-2 aircraft were sent to repair facilities or written off due to the impossibility of repair. The rest were restored by technical staff and field aviation repair workshops. However, many specialists noted shortcomings of the legendary Il-2. It had low effectiveness of bomb strike attacks, a huge level of combat losses. What was presented as the main advantage of the Il-2, armor for 1,941st, 1,945th years, was also insufficient. Armor did not save these flying tanks from being destroyed in large numbers by German fighters and anti-aircraft gunners. From here, the Il-2 and its semi-wooden construction, which made it an imperfect aircraft for the battlefield, further reduced the combat survivability of this machine. Despite the insufficiently perfect material part, the effectiveness of the Soviet assault aviation was reduced by numerous failures of its tactics and weak flight, shooting and tactical training of ordinary pilots in the early years of the war. But the single-engine and simple-in-construction assault aircraft was cheaper and easier to produce than the twin-engine all-metal bombers. In the very first days of the war, it turned out that single-seat assault aircraft suffered disproportionately large losses from enemy fighters. To protect the pilots, holes were cut in the upper part of the fuselage to allow for the placement and mounting of a machine gun. The temporary construction of the turret was called the death cabin. Later, the position of the machine gunner was included in the design of the IL-2, but this job remained one of the most dangerous professions of that war. Right now, we don't have a completely correct image of the hero pilot. Usually, it is the fighter with his list of victories, while bomber pilots and attack pilots undeservedly fade into the background. However, the tactics of the Soviet Air Force envisaged the use of aviation strictly in the interests of ground forces. Therefore, the more important the target, the more necessary it is to bomb it, and the stronger the enemy defends it. Dozens of anti-aircraft artillery guns are aimed at the attack aircraft, And it flies, unable to change the course already set by the anti-aircraft gunners until it destroys the target. The fighter still has the initiative. He can break away from heavy fire, change the direction of the attack again. In other words, he can somehow protect himself. But the assault aircraft can't protect itself. It is obliged to break through the fire to the target. Shooting at Gorbato was considered an incredibly risky business, as the mortality rate of these airfighters was twice as high as the possibility of shooting down the assault aircraft. A 6mm armor plate protected only from machine gun fire during attacks by enemy fighters from the tail side. Moreover, the angle of fire from a large-caliber machine gun did not always allow to fire at enemy machines, and the Germans quickly learned that it was necessary to attack the Black Death from the back and bottom, where the shooter could not hit them. But in addition to the legendary IL-2, with all its merits and shortcomings, there was another aircraft that undeservedly has a reputation of a serious machine. Yet this, the most primitive combat aircraft of the Great Patriotic War, was, strangely enough, also the most flying, and one of the most accurate. During the war, less than 12,000 U-2S were produced, many of which went not into precise bombers, but into communication aircraft. This is half as many as the known IL-2 attack aircraft, which lifted twice as many bombs as the U-2. Also, during the war, 11,000 P-2 bombers were produced, which lifted 4 times more bombs than the modest biplane. And, at first glance, it seems that the role of the training aircraft model 1928 in the events of the war was not particularly significant. Moreover, due to its extremely low speed, with bombs it could only cover 100 kilometers per hour, it was impossible to use it during the day. And where can you get at night before the distribution of night sights? Therefore, a persistent perception has formed in the mass consciousness that the small night plane was only engaged in disturbing bombardments. He flew, buzzed, gave no peace. Well, it seems depriving the enemy of sleep is also a combat job. However, there is one but. It's very difficult to accurately bomb with free-falling bombs from a plane during World War II. In the year 1941, according to data in the Soviet Air Force, more than 2/3 of pilots, even during the day on the range, did not hit a target the size of 40,000 square meters, which is several football fields. In the field of battle, 4-hectare targets are rare, so in reality, they hit even less often. Even low-flying IL-2 attack aircraft hit a target of 2,000 square meters, no more often than in 13% of cases. And this is on the range with the most experienced pilot. Bombing could be done more accurately from a dive. For example, the Soviet I-16, diving down to 40 meters, hit targets the size of 1,000 square meters in 90% of cases. However, for diving, pilots with good flight experience are needed, and there were very few of them in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The problem wasn't even hitting the target. The goal was not to accidentally hook our own in the process. That's why Soviet bombers were assigned targets no closer than 800 meters from their own infantry. With one exception, U-2. They were assigned targets directly close to their own troops. The reason was simply low speed. The biplane flew 3 times slower than the IL-2 and 4 times slower than the P-2, which allowed for much better targeting. Due to the nature of nighttime flights, it could descend much lower than daytime aircraft. A typical U-2 strike was made from a height of 400 to 800 meters in moonless night, and not higher than 1,200 meters in moonlit. Because of this, they were used for night strikes even in Stalingrad, where the Germans from Aviation used only dive-bombing Junkers 87. Here is a quote from a participant in the Battle of Stalingrad. "No modern night bomber can be given such tasks as the U-2 are given. They are tasked to bomb a house, a specific house, not to the left or right, but this one, where the Germans have settled. They are tasked to bomb the German half of the quarter, while the other half is in our hands. And with their small speed, with their ideal bombing accuracy, they carry out the task. They bomb exactly this house. It seems, how can it be possible to bomb more accurately at night than during the day? Even at the lowest altitude, did the pilots of that era see anything at night before thermal imagers? The thing is, after a short period of dark training, a person's eyes are capable of seeing even single photons. It's just that in modern conditions of light pollution, as it is now called, this ability is not used. The equivalent of 1 or 2 photons is a candle flame from 10 kilometers away. The typical flight altitude of a U-2 was high enough to distinguish how a person on the ground is taking a drag on a cigarette. The well-known expression of night flyers that a pilot should be able to land on an airfield by the commander's cigarette was essentially not an exaggeration. The forward airfields for these biplanes in Podskok were no more than 20 kilometers from the enemy, so they were designated by hand lanterns like a flying mouse, extremely dim by any standards. The enemy would have shelled and bombed the airfield to prevent them from working. Pilots over the battlefield usually had a sector ranging from 1.5 to 2 kilometers, which they observed until they saw sparks from the stovepipe of a dugout, a single flash of gunfire, or a bonfire lit by a resting soldier below. The tactics varied from there. In some regiments, U-2 simply went for the target and bombed it. In others, he throttled the engine, that is, he cut the gas and, almost inaudible due to the noise of the afterburner, glided towards the target at angles up to 30 degrees. According to polygon tests, even in complete silence, the aircraft was not audible until it descended to 700 meters. Sherman, looking at the target through the cut in the wing, gave the command to drop the bomb. After this, the pilot immediately throttled up, but the target, revealing itself with light below, did not have time to change its position before the explosion. Only in the extreme case, if the enemy, taught by bitter experience, did not stoke the stoves, although it was not easy in winter, the navigator dropped a 3-kilogram illuminating bomb on a parachute. In its light, the aircraft attacked the target. However, in practice this was rare. The Germans, annoyed by constant flights, often opened fire on biplanes. They rarely hit, and their U-2 fire was often used as a point of aim. In addition to accuracy, the U-2 had another advantage: an unusual flight frequency for Soviet aviation. So, 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment in 1,802 days of work performed 23,672 combat flights. On average, 22 flights per day, although there were from 20 to 40 crews in it. Is that a lot or a little? For example, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment at AP-2 made 1,134 combat flights in 890 days of work, 130 per day, with practically the same number of aircraft. The U-2 of the 1st Aviation Regiment flew 17 times more often than the P-2 from the 2nd. Therefore, although the P-2 took 4 to 5 times more bombs, the regiment dropped only 980 tons of bombs on them. However, the U-2 Night Witches dropped 2,903 tons, twice as much. They also carried ammo incompatible with the P-2. For example, up to 8 rocket projectiles and ampoules with an igniting mixture were suspended on the U-2. Their regiment dropped 26,000. In addition, biplan dropped surrounded ammunition and carried partisans into the enemy's rear at night, which larger planes with their long run could not do. Only one of the U-2 pilots, Irina Sibrova, made 1,004 combat flights, approximately as many as an entire aviation regiment on the P-2. And although the tonnage she dropped was several times less, it is far from certain that she was significantly inferior in effectiveness to dozens of twin-engine machine crews. After all, as we noted above, this aircraft dropped bombs much closer to the target than daytime bombers or attack aircraft. The wooden biplane of Polikarpov was the most flying Soviet aircraft of the war. Only on it, Soviet pilots achieved thousands and more combat sorties. Attack aircraft, fighters, daytime bombers, they all managed to make no more than a few hundred sorties during the war. There were practically no people with more than 500 sorties beyond the parts of the U-2. Of all the night bombing sorties of the Soviet Air Force, there were 726,000, of which about 700,000 were on the U-2. On all other types of aircraft, the Red Army Air Force conducted only 850,000 strike sorties during that war. Of these, more than 600,000 were on the IL-2, the rest were mainly on the P-2. Another 20,000 were added by long-range aviation. So, the counted thousands of U-2 bombs made only 1.5 times fewer flights than 50,000 IL-2, P-2, IL-4, and many other machines. These are quite interesting figures because IL-2, for example, did not make 0 whole and 70 million flights. There are not so many at P-2, Yak-1, and any other Soviet warplane. This looks especially wild against the background that IL-2 produced twice as much during the war as U-2, and Yak-1 was undoubtedly much more numerous. The situation with dropped bombs is also surprising. Frontline bombers dropped 300,000 tons, of which U-2 dropped every third ton. How did it happen that several thousand biplanes dropped only 1.5 times fewer bombs than tens of thousands of IL-2s? The reason for this were the unusual flight qualities of the small aircraft. Firstly, due to its small mass, it has large wheels with relatively low pressure, which is necessary for takeoff from dirt in any weather. Secondly, it had a fairly large wing for such a light machine. It didn't allow him to develop high speed, but it created a large lift force at low speed. Therefore, it was safe to fly on it even in very low cloudiness, when literally no one else could fly at all. Finally, it helped that the U-2 was often used for free hunting, although it was not called that. The search for fires below and their processing with bombs was exactly free hunting. It was led not only forward, but also along the roads, searching for the headlights of tanks and cars. Large strike aircraft almost didn't fly on it. It required exceptional pilot experience. Where could Soviet aviation get such experienced pilots? Its pilots came to the front, as correctly noted in Soviet cinema, with a takeoff-landing training program. Due to this, they died frequently, lacking the time to gain experience. Most pilots of the same IL-2 or P-2 and 100 flights for the entire war did not make, even if they fought from its very beginning to the very end. This is clearly not about free hunting. And flights to designated aviation targets were only on the days of noticeable offensives. Since most days at the front were days of stagnation, large aviation did not have a significant impact on the course of battles during these periods. The U-2s did not depend on the work of the higher headquarters. They didn't need target indications. Their pilots, with hundreds of flights under their belt, were the most experienced in the Army. They themselves sought targets in the assigned square. They themselves adjusted. Such independence automatically allowed them to fly more often than others. But how did this unprotected plane made of cloth and wood turn out to be the most resilient? If, for one lost IL-2 ground attack aircraft, 62 aircraft had to fly out, for a daytime bomber, P-296, and for a fighter, 123, then for one lost U-2 and R-5 700 flights were needed. 7 aircraft flights. But R-5 can be disregarded, because such aircraft proved to be worse than the U-2 and were not produced during the war years. Only old machines from the 30s were used up. There were few flights on them. So non-combat biplanes had minimal losses among all types of Soviet aircraft. Before being shot down, one plane managed to make a dozen more flights than the IL-2. That is, despite having half the bomb load, it dropped 6 times more bombs. The P-2 outlived everything 8 times, so it could drop a couple of times more bombs for its combat life than this bomber with powerful engines, which surpassed the corn borer 14 times. Now, about the money. In the prices of the early 40s, the biplane from the 20s cost 25,000 rubles, the IL-2 175,000, the P-2 4 million. For the cost of one P-2, you could build 10 U-2, which would drop 20 times more than one P-2. With the IL-2, this increase would have been 36 times. From a military economics perspective, the polycarbonate bomber was significantly more effective than specialized military aircraft. Legal question: how so? The Germans had excellent fighter pilots. Moreover, they had night planes of an unattainable level for the Soviets, specialized hunters for night bombers, equipped with onboard radar. Their air defense forces were armed with tens of thousands of automatic guns. Where is the Soviet air defense? Finally, the training aircraft didn't even have armor plating. Why couldn't the Germans inflict major losses on U-2? The answer is paradoxical. The archaic biplane was so far behind its time that it even bypassed it. Expressing himself in modern language, he was stealthy, barely noticeable in the audible, visible, and radio frequency ranges. Indeed, wood and veneer did not absorb the waves of modern radars, and the metallic M11 engine was just too small to be definitely detected. Of course, experienced night pilots could see the U-2 with their own eyes, not radars if it flew low enough. But the Germans practically had no slow-moving fighters. The wing of the Messer was so small that its stall speed was higher than the maximum speed of the U-2. He couldn't match the speed with the victim, and hitting it while flying over it at night in a matter of seconds was another task. Sometimes such a shining ace was found among the Germans. On one night of the 1043rd year, Josef Kochiok ensured the regiment's night vision loss of 6 people, a third of all combat losses of night pilots for the entire war. However, such experience did not take root in the Luftwaffe. The work was too risky. That very Joseph didn't live even 2 months after his success. In one of the night flights, he collided with a victim plane. The Germans simply couldn't afford to lose a high-class specialist in exchange for 3 shot-down bombers. They only had a few hundred fighter pilots on the entire Eastern Front. Remarkably, the U-2S remained relevant not just in World War II but also during the Korean War. There they managed to bomb American airfields and destroy jet fighters. The Americans couldn't bomb their airfields in response. They essentially didn't exist. At night, they quietly landed on dirt roads and drove into special hangars or mountain tunnels. One F-94 died along with the pilot, trying to knock down a cruise missile. The speed of the supermodern, as it was higher than that of the biplane. However, due to difficulties accessing Korean archives, we do not have figures on North Korean flights. In our days, it's easy to find the U-2's wreckage. These drones have typical speeds of 100 to 124 miles per hour. They are made of metal and also often only have a motor, but instead of a fan and a fuselage, they are covered with glass plastic. Small piston engines are radically quieter than the huge jet wonders of piloted aircraft. They can literally not be heard a kilometer away. Radars, as in World War II, help against them so-so. But that's a completely different story. We hope you found this brief overview of World War II aviation interesting. Thank you for watching and see you in future episodes on our channel.